Hello. So we have Phil Ainslie today. He's a hobby beekeeper. He's been doing that for 10 years. He was the former president of the Williamson County Area Beekeepers Association, and he's now the secretary of the same Williamson County Area Beekeepers Association. And he's a master beekeeper at level 1. And the Williamson County Beekeepers Association is focused on supporting new and established beekeepers and on increasing beekeeping knowledge and participation in the community. Thank you very much, Phil, for coming and joining us, and I look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, well, my presentation is called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And so you will be hearing some disturbing things later in this presentation, but most of it's good. So we'll start out with a little trivia. I'll go through each slide and then I'll probably expand somewhat. So we see here that 500 miles is the average worker, is what the average worker bee flies in her life. 250,000 to 6 million is the number of grains on a pollinating bee, and that's flower dependent because pollens are various sizes. The amount of honey produced per year by a hive is 400 pounds, but beekeepers only keep about 50 to 80 pounds. Here in Texas, we're doing pretty well if we ever get 50 pounds. Generally, I'll get about 30 pounds per hive. 1 pound of honey, 768 bees must visit 2 million flowers, fly 55,000 miles or more, and they'll make 10 million round trips. Commercial value, 14.6 billion in the United States alone, and 40% of the produce that you eat is pollinated by bees. This slide here, you will see over on your left at the top where it says honey. This is all honey here. This is from a brood box. And so a brood box will have the brood in the center. There will be pollen along here. The pollen is actually their protein, and they need a good mix of protein in order for them to be healthy. In the brood, which is in the center, the queen lays, and you have a nice pattern here. A good pattern is when you see the brood pretty much like this in the center. This is an empty brood cell, and these are capped brood right here. All right, so over here on the left, you will see all this row after row after row of bee boxes. The bottom box is generally where the brood is, and then the top, or the top 3 or 4 or more, are honey. This is an almond orchard, and bees are transported to almond orchards in California by the truckload. Almonds are not pollinated by anything other than honeybees. So God save the queen. We've got the queen here. She's the only fertile female. Now she'll mate with several drones at what we call a drone gathering site. I think of it as kind of the biker bar for drones. The drones are the males. They are unfertilized. So when a queen lays an egg, if she doesn't fertilize it, that becomes a drone. If she fertilizes it, it becomes a worker bee. Whether it becomes a queen or not depends on how much of the royal jelly is put in these individual cells here. And this, by the way, is not her racing number. This is a study, and so they have this queen marked with the number 62. Beekeepers will put a dot of paint on that queen so that they can easily identify her in that crowd of several bees. And these are the queen's retinue. They will, feed her, they will groom her, they keep the hive temperature controlled for her. So she cannot really do anything for herself other than she goes around and lays eggs. Now she emits pheromones, and pheromones, in fact, all the bees emit pheromones. They are signal perfumes. So Of the pheromones, there's several, but just to give you a few, they have an alarm pheromone. And so if you go up to a hive and you disturb the hive, there's guard bees out there and they will alert the hive if there's danger. And if you squash a bee, they release a pheromone and that just attracts more bees to you. So if you got a bee on you, just brush it off, don't squash it. There's brood recognition pheromone, there's drone pheromone, egg marking pheromone, forager pheromone, and others. Now the queen will lay about 2,000 eggs per day at the height of summer. And as I said earlier, she cannot feed herself and neither can the drone. In fact, the drone, I just picture him kind of sitting in there in the hive. The ladies have taken care of him. He's throwing his feet back, drinking a beer. But he gets kicked out in the fall because he doesn't really do anything other than mate. And so they have no reason to keep him around the fall, and they'll kick him out because he's just another mouth to feed. He dies after mating. And by the way, you notice up here, this is the drone. He's got these big old eyes. So think for a moment why he might have those big eyes. Anyway, so these drones gather at that drone gathering site, and they're waiting for a bee to come. And the reason he has those big eyes is so he can see that queen bee off in the distance. And they'll go racing out there, and 14 or 15 will mate with her, and that will be her one and only mating flight. She'll go back to the hive and begin laying, and that will be all of the sperm for her entire life. Typically, a queen will live anywhere from 2 to 5 years. Used to be beekeepers would get 3 to 5 years out of queens. We're doing well if we get 2 years now, and that's all part of the honeybee decline that you've probably heard about. So bees have various jobs. They'll start out after they hatch out. They're housekeepers. They'll clean up that cell. They'll clean around the cell, and they'll also help keep the brood warm. Then they become feeders, and they will feed the older larvae, and then move along to feed some of the younger larvae. And then they become undertakers. They will remove dead bees, dead larvae, larvae that are ill and sick. They'll remove objects that might get in that hive. I've seen them, if I'm working and some grass gets blown into the hive, they will actually remove that. Maybe the next day I'll see that piece of grass laying out there in front on the lip there at the hive. Other insects that might get in to the hive will get removed by the undertaker. And then they go on guard duty. And so there will be a few bees there at the entrance, and they watch for anything that doesn't belong in that hive. And that might be me, it could be a mouse, it could be, one time in my bee yard, I have it fenced off and I failed to close the fence one time, and the calf got in there and they took out after that calf and chased her off. It could be a wasp, it could be even a bee from another hive. So guards will fight them off, and then, oh, and by the way, when you're working your hive, the guards will, if it's European bee, they will warn you, and they'll come and bounce off of you. They'll bounce off my veil, or they'll bounce off my face and warn me to stay away. If it's Africanized bees, many times there's no warning, they just attack. And then they become field workers, and that is the last 22 days of their lives. And they literally work themselves to death. They gather pollen, nectar, and water, and at the end of their life, many of them die before they ever make it back because their wings are all shredded, and they just can't survive anymore. So honey is really good for us. It has sugars, which is, of course, carbohydrate, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and antioxidants. Let me back up for just a moment here. I was talking about the jobs. At about 14 years old, when they start working as field bees, they will go out and starting at sunrise, they'll go out and visit flowers, get nectar and pollen and propolis, which we'll talk about later, and water. And they'll go about 2 to 5 miles. During a dearth in the summer, when it's dry and there's not much in the way of wildflowers, or on a warm day in the winter, they'll sometimes have to go out as much as 5 miles to find what they need. They'll make about 10 trips a day, about an hour on each trip, and they'll return to the hive at sunset. They only go to one type of flower during that 1 hour visit. Typically, most people think that bees go from one flower to another flower to another flower and different flowers, but no, they go to one flower at each visit. So they'll go to one kind of flower. So they might go to, for example, Gaillardia, or maybe they'll go to clover. So it just depends. I don't know how they would decide which flower to go to, but they will send signals by using a dance to the other bees in the hive when they come across a good mix of flowers. Now we'll move along. All right, so honey has some antibacterial and antiseptic properties, and it's used for both burns and ulcers. It's actually approved by the Food and Drug Administration for burns and ulcers. They will use primarily Manuka honey for that, and it's treated with gamma rays in order to make it completely sterile. It'll soothe sore throat, reduce cough. It's used many times for allergies. That's anecdotal. In other words, he said, she said. So people use honey for their allergies. I don't know if it really works or not, but if it makes some folks feel better, then good. Hard to do a good study for allergies because the honey properties change by the hive, by the month. It just depends on which flowers are blooming. Most folks have allergies to grass, and they don't get pollen from grass. It's also used as a hallucinogenic, and it was used in chemical warfare. And I can just hear you all going, "Hey, what?" Well, in 401 BC, the Persians used rhododendron polycom to defeat the Roman army. And so anyway, the Roman soldiers were chasing the Persian army along the Black Sea. The Persians gathered pots of their honey, and they left them out there for the Romans to find. Well, the feasting Romans ended up with some of the side effects from this honey, which were lightheadedness, a feeling of euphoria, possible hallucinations, sickness, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of consciousness, seizures, low blood pressure, lightheadedness, feelings of euphoria, which I already mentioned, sorry. And as you might imagine, that gave the Persians quite an advantage. And the Persian army killed all the Roman soldiers and had very few Persian losses. As a matter of fact, that particular honey is still sold today for about $166 a pound. And there are some of these rhododendrons that actually grow here in the United States in the Appalachian Mountains, but most of that particular rhododendron is in the Middle East, and some of the tribes over there still use it, much like our Native Americans use peyote. So honey has a long shelf life. They found 3,000-year-old honey from the pyramids in Egypt, and it was still edible. I imagine it was pretty dark by that time because honey gets dark as it ages, but there's nothing wrong with it as it ages. Slaying microbes. So the reason that honey has medicinal action is osmotic concentration. I'll expand on all these a little bit. Hydrogen peroxide, presence of specialized plant compounds, acidity, and as a protective barrier. Now the osmotic concentration is because of the high concentration of sugar, and as a result, it pulls moisture. And so when you put that on the wound, it pulls some of the exudate from your skin out of that wound. And it also helps dry up some of those bacteria. The water and the oxygen then in that wound will then get converted to hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is mild enough in the honey to act as a bactericidal and not actually burn the skin as stronger concentrations of hydrogen peroxide can do. There are other specialized plant compounds, which more of those are found in the Manuka honey. That's why it's frequently used for healing. The acidity is a factor and a protective barrier as well. Now here we have a picture over on the right. This is Manuka myrtle, and that is grown in Australia and New Zealand. This is where most of your Manuka honey comes from. And here you can see a wound being wrapped and treated with honey. I've used it on wounds. The FDA has wraps that are impregnated with Manuka honey that are used for wounds. It doesn't work quite as fast as, say, some of the silver compounds that are used for burns, but it does work. Okay, bee venom. So there is research on bee venom. Melittin is what actually causes the sting, and it is also an anti-inflammatory. The venom increases the cortisol, which is a natural hormone. Your body releases cortisol on its own. Typically, we think of cortisol as a stress hormone. So because of its anti-inflammatory properties, it is used to treat arthritis, multiple sclerosis, slow certain cancer growth. It is quite expensive. None of this has been actually approved by the Food and Drug Administration. This is all in the research stage at this point. It takes an awful lot of bees to get a gram of honey. Now, the way it's done is with this device over here. This is actually a honey collector, and this has a static charge on it. They put it in front of a hive. The bee is attracted to it. It stings this for some reason. I guess it's the static charge somehow causes the bee to sting. They will sting it. The venom goes to the bottom of this tray, and it's dried and then stored in a heat-controlled environment. Beeswax. Beeswax is used for balms, salves, candles. And regarding candles, by the way, one of the reasons that beeswax was used for candle in churches is that beeswax candles don't smoke. They're not sooty like paraffin candles, for example. It's used for wooden furniture polish, soap, skin barriers, for cuts and scratches, which I already mentioned, as a fire starter and also to attract bees. Now, when I'm working my bees, some of the scrap wax that I have, in other words, the wax that's just strained, when it's strained, you end up with some wax that we call slum gum, which has like things that you don't want in the honey. And when that's strained out, then I strain it through burlap, and that burlap then I use as a fire starter. The scent, the pheromone scent that's on the wax also attracts bees, so I can use that to attract bees if I'm trying to attract bees for a new hive. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but if you haven't, this is a real treat. If you purchase wax comb, you just take a bite of this and chew it up. I don't know, it just seems to taste different than regular honey when you chew this up. That's all in my mind, I'm sure, but it's quite a treat, at least for me. This is some of my homemade balm. I use this on my fingertips because they have a tendency to crack, especially in the winter when it's dry. And so I carry this with me, and I'll just put that on my fingertips. Works very well. It's wax, cocoa butter, and what's the other ingredient? Almond oil. Propolis. Propolis is bee glue. And so the bees, this is propolis. They use that to seal up around the hive. And here's a big old clump of it here that somebody gathered up. They make tinctures out of it. And there's been some research on this. I pulled this from an article in the Pharmacology Science an article in 2013. And their research is on propolis as an antioxidant, antibacterial, antifungal. It inhibits yeast, so it can be used vaginally. It's has antiprotozoan activity, antitumoral, anti-inflammatory, protect the liver, and also to reduce cavities. So a lot of interesting possibilities there. Propolis has various origins, depends on what tree they get it from. It's a resin from trees. And so when they do research, it's quite variable because the bees aren't real particular about where they get the propolis. Okay, funny honey, the ugly truth of funny honey. So what is funny honey? Well, it looks like honey, but it's been adulterated. So they did a study of some honey that was purchased online, 74 local honeys. Look at that number, 87% of them contained sugar syrup. So they were adulterated, diluted. The European Union, they did a study there and they found 14% of tested honey samples were adulterated. Asian honey is currently banned in Europe and the United States. Unfortunately, Asian honey is laundered through other countries. And so you think you might be getting honey from, I'll just pick a country, let's say Venezuela, and it's actually coming from China and sold through Venezuela. It may actually contain some real honey. Tastes like honey, looks like honey, but it's got corn syrup, cane sugar, and other such things in it. Now, there are some beekeepers that feed excessive amounts of sugar to dilute their honey because it's cheaper to sell sugared honey to harvest sugared honey, I should say, and then they get more profit rather than waiting until it's actually cured. I don't know of anybody that does that, or at least I hope I don't. I do feed sugar to my bees, but only in an emergency. So if they run out of stores, because the honey is their primary energy source, and if they don't have honey to get them through the winter or through a summer dearth, they're going to die. And so we'll give them some sugar syrup for a week, couple weeks to get them through that, and then leave it alone after that. Because it's not really good for the bees for them to get excessive amounts of that anyway. And it's certainly not good to have that type of adulterated honey out there as well. And I understand there are some beekeepers that even sell unripe honey, which is honey that hasn't been fully capped. The problem with that, the moisture content can be off too, and it'll ferment. Honey has a moisture content of right around 18%, so you want it to be lower than 18%. But not all honeys are the same. Darker honeys, such as buckwheat honeys, have more of I'm going to back up for just a little bit because I forgot to mention this. The darker honeys actually have more of the, let's see, those things that help as far as antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and so forth, and more of the healing properties that are associated with Manuka honey. So that there is a possibility, there's some research being done on buckwheat honey that it may be as good or maybe even better than the Manuka honey. Now, interesting thing about this adulterated honey is that there's so much of it, and so a couple different ways that you can tell when you purchase honey is if you take a drop of honey and you put it in a glass of water, just drop it into that glass of water. If it goes right to the bottom, it hasn't been adulterated with any of that sugary stuff. You don't know about other adulterations such as insecticides and such as some antibiotics that we no longer use that some of the other countries use. But at least you know that it's pure honey and it hasn't been diluted. So if that drop goes right to the bottom, that's a good indicator. If you take a drop and put it on your thumb and it just stays as a drop, that's probably pure honey, but if it spreads out, it's been adulterated. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about the ugly pasteurization. You might wonder, well, what's wrong with that? When our milk is pasteurized, the reason they pasteurize it is to stop the crystallization. Honey crystallizes, and if you buy honey and you see crystals in there, if you're going to the grocery store and you see some crystals in the bottom, that hasn't been pasteurized. When they pasteurize it, it removes everything except the honey, the flavor. You're still getting honey, but you're not getting the enzymes, the vitamins, the minerals, the amino acids, and the pollen. It can't be traced when it's filtered, which is also a problem when it's pressure filtered, because when the Food and Drug Administration does an inspection of honey, and if it's been pasteurized, they don't know where it came from. They can tell by analyzing the pollen if it hasn't been pasteurized. So beekeepers strain honey. I strain honey because things get in there that we don't want to be in there, like bee parts, could be a bee leg, maybe a whole bee. Sometimes some propolis gets in there. So we want to strain all that out, chunks of wax and so forth. So we strain that, but we don't heat it up and we don't pressure filter it. So a couple of other things you can do. You can look for this label. It's now, I think they have it in color. This is a colored picture. Unfortunately, I didn't have one, but they have a nice sticker now. I think it's got silver and purple. And anyway, Real Texas Beekeeper or Real Texas Honey is what you can look for. You can also purchase your honey from a known local beekeeper, or you can, like I said, look for that Real Texas Honey label. You can, if you go to farmers markets, many times there are beekeepers there that sell honey. We're getting more and more hobby beekeepers out there, and a lot of hobby beekeepers also raise honeybees to get an exemption on their property tax. And that's kind of a lengthy process. So, but one of the requirements is that you sell your honey, and most of the hobby beekeepers that sell their honey will do that at farmers markets. The sting. Well, bees die after the sting, but bees do get grumpy from time to time. And the reason that bees get grumpy can vary. It might be if it's if it's a cloudy, humid day, they get a little grumpy. If the queen has died, they get particularly grumpy. If something has been bothering the hive, like maybe a beekeeper's been bothering it a lot, or maybe there's an animal around that's bothering it a lot. If I go out to my hives and something has been bothering my bees, then they're more likely to be aggressive than they would otherwise. I have all European bees. That's what beekeepers want. We don't want anything. Well, there are actually some beekeepers that intentionally keep Africanized bees, but not me. The drones, by the way, don't sting, and the queen can, but she doesn't usually. It takes about 1,500 stings to be toxic, but if you're allergic, it only takes one. So here we see the bee sting, and this will come loose. The stinger will stay in the skin. It's barbed. You don't want to take this off with tweezers. You want to scrape it off, because what you don't want to do is squeeze the little sac that's the venom sac and then just insert or inject rather more venom. So credit card, fingernail, pocket knife, scrape it off. This is what it looks like when it gets inflamed. I don't mind the sting so much, man. It's a little uncomfortable. That doesn't bother me, but boy, I sure hate the itching afterwards. And by the way, regarding the sting, the pheromone that they release, if you kill a bee, if you get enough, I counted 300 stingers one time on my bee veil. I had a particularly hot hive. That's what beekeepers call those grumpy, aggressive bees. I think they had lost their queen, and when I was working it, boy, they were all over me. And that all that venom all that pheromone rather left the scent of bananas. So don't go with your bees after you've eaten bananas. Africanized bees. They look just like any other bee. You can't really tell by looking at them. If this is a swarm of bees here, they could be Africanized. They could be European bees. Most of the bees that are wild in Texas now are a mixture. So they're not pure African bees. They're what we call Africanized. Africanized bees are very aggressive. They are protective is probably the proper word. But as far as I'm concerned, it's aggressive because they'll chase you. They'll continue to go after you for a quarter to a half a mile. European bees, yeah, if they're upset, they'll chase you 20, 30 feet, and that's about it. They are good honey producers. They do swarm a lot, but this is due to how they evolved in Africa. And they do something called usurpation. So it's an unwanted move in. So what they do is they accumulate on the side of the hive. So this is a European beehive in here. It could be Italian, Carolean. There's the various types of European bees, which there are no honeybees that are native to America. They were all brought in from Europe, and we didn't have any Africanized bees until approximately 1980, when they were accidentally released from a research hive in Brazil, and they thrived here and have moved north from there. But they will accumulate alongside a hive like this, and they'll send in some workers. And these workers will just kind of work their way in and around when the guard bees aren't watching, and they'll get that hive pheromone on them. And so the hive doesn't realize that these are no longer, they don't look at them as unwanted bees. So if bees come in from another hive, usually the guard bees will chase them off. In this case, these guys are trying to work their way in. Once they get enough of them in there, they'll find the queen and kill her. And then this queen, the Africanized queen, will go in and she starts laying. And now your nice, calm European bees are the hot, aggressive Africanized bees. I have not had it happen. I saw it start on one of my hives, and I immediately went out there with some soapy water and killed him, because I don't want those guys to be out there mating with other bees and spread more and more Africanized bees in Texas. So I don't like killing bees, but if they're Africanized, I don't hesitate. Okay, so a little more on Africanized bees. They're easily disturbed, so disturbances around the hive, mowing, the vibration and sound will bother them, and they may come after you. They actually prefer ground hives as opposed to hives in trees, although that's not always the case. Here's some that are in, I guess this is a barrel. Looks like an old 50-gallon barrel maybe, or maybe it's a tire. As I said, they'll chase you quite a ways. They do swarm more often, already mentioned. I talked about the invasion, and but I could, my queen, my nice old European queen, she might decide to go out, and if they swarm, the queen will go out and mate with a drone, with 14 or 15 or more drones, and there might be 3 or 4 of those drones that are Africanized. And so one week I might have nice friendly bees, and a couple of weeks later I might have some grumpy bees. So it just depends on who they mate with and what sperm happens to go fertilize that egg. And as I said earlier, you can't tell by looking. So a little bit about swarming. Why do they swarm? Well, it's actually a type of reproduction. They subdivide to become 2 hives, and they'll do that when the hive gets too large. They might do that as the hive health declines, but it is essential to their survival. They'll send out scout bees to go out and look for a place to settle. Several of them go out, they'll come back, and they inform the hive and make a decision. And the way they do that is by a particular type of dance that they do in the hive. they'll give directions to where this new location is, and the directions are given based on the position of the sun. And I've read how they do this, and it's a little confusing to me, but the bees have it all worked out. So prior to the move, and the scout bees, they've decided where they're going to go. The current queen that's in there, she's going to get fed a little less because she's going to have to fly. So she needs to be in good shape. The workers will start raising a new queen, and so they'll in one or more cells, and usually there's several. Typically they're along the bottom of the hive, and they look much like a peanut shell. And so it's a larger cell, and they put more royal jelly in there. That will become eventually a queen. There can only be one queen in a hive. And so there'll be two for a very short period of time as this one gets ready to move out. But the one that hatches out, she'll go around and kill all of the other unhatched queens. And so when the new queen's ready, the old queen will take off with half the hive, and they'll go to the new location. So here you see a swarm in the air. And I actually had a swarm land right out in front of my house. My wife comes in, she says, "Your bees are acting crazy. They're all over the place." And I said, "Sounds like a swarm." I went up there, and sure enough, there was a swarm in one of the shrubs out front. So I captured them. But this is a swarm that's resting. You might find this intimidating, but actually they're quite gentle when they're in a swarm like this. They're not guarding anything. They don't have anything to guard other than the queen in there. There's no honey. There's no nectar in there. And so you could take your hand and stick your hand right in there, and they wouldn't sting you. Now, don't squeeze one, because if you did that, yes, then they would. This, by the way, is not a swarm. That'd be terrible if you had a swarm come and land on you like that. But they smear honey on their face to make what they call a bee beard. I've never done it. I've known people that have. So here you see a fella, he's sticking his hand in there. It's an odd sensation when they're crawling all over your hand like that. So the old bees go with the swarm. The new queen stays at the old hive location. And the swarm, they protect the queen. She'll be in the center of this cluster, and they'll keep her warm. They'll keep the temperature where it needs to be by fanning or shivering, as the case may be. So they'll rest there. They could rest on a limb or your mailbox, and then they'll move along. And once they're at their new location, then their duties begin. They start going through that whole list of things that I went over earlier. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the storm this year. So it started out great. We had an early spring. We had good weather. The queen started laying. The brood numbers increased after the winter low numbers, because during the winter, the numbers are reduced. The queen doesn't lay as much, and the numbers are reduced. They have to survive the winter. They've stored their honey. They've got some protein in there in the way of pollen. They're good to go. Well, we had this nice early spring. The queen started laying. The numbers increased, and when the numbers increase, then there's more food being consumed. Well, before they could start packing away more food, the winter storm hits. Then the bad began. The bees began to shiver to keep warm. So they'll be in the center of this hive. They'll cluster and they'll shiver with the queen in the center. And the ones on the outside will move in. The ones on the inside will move out so that everybody has a chance to warm up. As they get cold, they will go up. They'll usually start down here in the bottom, and they'll work their way up, eating the stores as they go. And if they haven't stored enough honey, remember, they were already starting to increase numbers. They were consuming stores already. So they had a low number of stores. It got cold. There's not enough food in here. They're shivering and they starve. And that's what happened to a lot of our bees this year. Then the rains began, and so if they did make it through the winter okay, which mine did, because I always leave a little, probably more honey than I need to. It was good that I did this year. The hives were already weakened. The bees couldn't get out due to the rains. The rains came along and washed the nectar off the flowers. So when you see all that rain out there, it washes that nectar off. The bees couldn't get enough nectar. And once again, they began to weaken and starve. So it was the perfect storm this year for losing bees. Then there's something called honeybee decline. And I was asked to talk about this. The primary culprit is the varroa mite. This is the varroa mite right here. Ugly little critter. Think of it kind of as the rat. For human beings, the rat carries diseases. For the bee, the varroa mite carries diseases. Here you see a couple of them on the back of the bee. What they do, we used to think that they fed on the hemoglobin, which is the blood in the bees, but actually they feed on fat bodies that are underneath these plates. So they do carry viruses. They get something called a wing virus, and these wings will actually shrivel up, and the bees can't fly, and they end up dying. You can lose the hive because of that. That's our biggest culprit right now. But it's a perfect storm that's happening as far as the decline in bees. Monoculture farming. There isn't the variety of wildflowers out there. There's not the mix of pollens that they need for a good, healthy diet. There's a lot of corn around me, and there's a lot of monoculture. I've got cotton. They can get some nectar from cotton. They don't get it from the flower. They actually get it from what's called the leaf exudate. So it's a secretion that's on the bottom of the leaf. So they get some from cotton, some from some nectar. Cotton honey has a tendency to crystallize pretty quick. So if you're ever getting cotton honey, it's nice mild honey, but boy, it'll crystallize fast. They use that a lot for making creamed honey. If you haven't had creamed honey, you need to try it sometime. There is a variety of pollen that's produced in a normal pasture with a lot of wildflowers, but as you get the buildup of monocultures, then you have a reduction in pollen, and so they don't get a good balanced diet. Transport is a problem because beekeepers are part of the problem. They'll transport bees back and forth across the country from, say, Texas to California for the almonds, from California up to Minnesota for various plants, and then down to Florida for the fruit, and then during that time they get stressed and they can pick up diseases during the transport. So we're actually part of the problem as well. Insecticides, including the systemic insecticides like neonicotinoids. They thought initially that the neonics would be safe for bees. It does not kill them like a spray does, but what it does do is over time it accumulates in the colony and it weakens the hive. And so when you get a weakness here and a weakness here and a weakness there and another weakness, it all begins to accumulate. And pretty soon your hives are only living a couple years, or you completely lose the hive. There's one fellow, I was reading an article, he lost 4,000 hives, commercial beekeeper, and it all happened within a couple-week period. Habitat loss, hive beetles can be a problem on a weak hive, generally not a problem if you've got a good strong hive because they'll drive them off, and weather, of course, is an issue as well. So look at that loss, 40%, 40 to 50% per year in the United States. Can you imagine any other business that would have a 40 or 50% loss? How do we survive as commercial beekeepers? Well, we have to do some things that we didn't do before, and that's what we call bee splits, where we do it kind of like an artificial swarming situation. We'll split hive. It's the only way the commercial beekeepers can survive now. 20 to 30 years ago, this was the loss, 10 to 15%. So pretty dramatic. So what can you do for bees? Well, if you get a swarm, call a beekeeper because they can come and get them. Most of the time there's a charge for it because it's our time. We do have equipment that we use, and our survival rate on a bee capture for a swarm is about 50%. So yeah, there's more than likely going to be a fee for that. But if you know a beekeeper and you're buddies with him, and he may do you a favor and just come out and do it at no charge. Typically when I do it, I just do it as a service, but I don't do a whole lot of capturing of swarms because many times they're in trees. I'm getting too old to climb ladders and climb trees. If they're in a house, I don't do that. But if it's an easy swarm to capture, yeah, I'll do it for one of the neighbors. Extractions are if you've got a hive like this one. This is in an attic and a soffit. Here you have some nice fresh white comb. This will turn dark over time. So older comb is darker. But not all beekeepers do extraction. It's a bit of a specialty, and of course they charge more. What else can you do? Well, you can plant bee-friendly plants, shrubs, and trees, such things as horse mint, lavenders, poppies, etc. And if you want to know what to plant, there's plenty of information online. I'm not much of a biologist, so I think plant names just don't roll off my tongue. Let native wildflowers grow. So if you've got some area of your property where you can let the native wildflowers grow as opposed to just have grass, then do so. Here we see some horse mint on this side, and over here you see some gaillardia, Indian blanket. The bees like both those pretty well. You can always put out water for bees. This is a chicken dog water, probably a dog or a cat water. Put some little pebbles in there so that they don't drown. They'll land on these pebbles and then get down there and sip at that water. If you just have this all full of water, many of them, you'll find a lot of dead bees in there that get in there and drown. Avoid insecticides and buy local honey. In addition, you can educate yourself and children about bees. You might want to consider a couple of hives. I don't recommend just one because it is livestock, and sometimes if you start out with just one and you lose it, then you're a total loss. But if you buy a couple of them to start, or I don't recommend as a newbie that you get any more than 4 hives, but a couple to start is a good way to start. Our club has a scholarship program for youth. And so between the ages of generally 10 and 17, they can apply for that scholarship, and you can do that online. We do that once a year, although we didn't this year because of the COVID. Different kinds of Texas bees. I was asked to talk about those. So we have mason bees. That's these dudes right here. Look kind of like a fly. You've probably seen them around. This is a mason bee house here. So you can, these are like little soda straws. And so they're solitary bees. They will lay their egg in there. And you may have noticed from time to time something like this. This is from my generator that I keep out in the workshop. And mason bee got in there and the ground plug and set up a home and laid an egg. And now I've got some mud in my ground plug. They are native to North America. They gather loose pollen from head to toe. They just get covered with it. And they're very good pollinators, actually better pollinators than honeybees. The reason honeybees are such good pollinators is because there's just so many of them. This is a solitary bee, but as a single bee, it outperforms a single honeybee any day. They do have a mild venom, but it won't cause anaphylactic shock. It's not very painful. They're gentle and docile. They don't produce any honey. They're not social bees like honeybees are. And the females can sting, but they're not aggressive at all. They're very mild-mannered bees. Bumblebees, large bees. Most of you are familiar with them. Have a hairy body and thorax. They're ground nesters. They're good pollinators. They don't store large quantities of nectar and pollen like honeybees. They can sting, but less likely to sting than hornets. They use what's called sonification, buzz pollination. And so what they will do when they pollinate a flower is they will essentially shake the flower to get the pollen. And I think they're the only ones that do that. I could be wrong on that. Squash bees have pronounced abdominal stripes. This is squash bee here, hairy back legs for pollen. They nest in the soils, gardens, pathways. They don't sting. Leafcutter bees, I noticed there was a leafcutter bee in a picture earlier, and they have very large mandibles, very hairy, carry pollen only on their abdomen, not on their whole body and legs like honeybees do. And they're not aggressive, and they have just a mild sting. Carpenter bees, about the same size as a bumblebee. They will chew into wood and set up their nest there. This is you can see they have a large and no hair on their abdomen. They are pollinators. They pollinate an assortment of plants. They're solitary. They nest in wood. When we were out in South Carolina on vacation a couple years ago, we saw a lot of these flying around. They were all around us, but they didn't bother us at all. They can sting, but it's not likely. Okay, now if you want to check out a video on the honeybee decline, this is a pretty good one, The Vanishing Bees. A lot of information on there. It's kind of heartbreaking when you watch it and you see some of the losses the beekeepers have had. Any questions?
So Ashley was asking if do you have any local honeys that you would recommend that's not adulterated?
Yes, in Georgetown, if you go to the farmer's market, the Oakley, Jimmy Oakley sells honey, and his is not adulterated. In fact, I would say I'm 99% sure that probably any honey you buy at a farmer's market is not going to be adulterated.
All right, and Amanda asked if do commercial beekeepers insure their bees for losses?
You know, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not a commercial beekeeper, and nobody's ever asked me that before. Golly, I hope so. I don't know.
And then Ashley was also wanting to know, are the other native bees declining much like the honeybees are?
I know that bumblebees are. I can't speak to the other bees, but I have heard that bumblebees are, yes.
And we've got Anya's asking, what are the lot size limitations? Like if you wanted to set up 2 hives, do they need a certain amount of space around the hives?
No, they will go 2 to 5 miles. A couple things to keep in mind. If you're setting up hives in a city, some cities have codes where there's a limit on whether you can have hives in the city or the number of hives. If you have a neighbor with a swimming pool next door, sometimes they'll go over to the swimming pool next door to get water, and the neighbors may not like that. You check with your neighbors before you set up a hive to make sure that they're okay with it. But yeah, it's we have hives in cities. I think Georgetown, you can have 2. I don't live in Georgetown. I'm about an hour and a quarter north, up by east of Temple. And places like New York City, even Austin, there are hives up on the roofs of some of the businesses. I think there's a hotel, I'm not sure which one. I know one of our beekeepers has bees on the roof of one of the hotels.
Nancy asked, do you know how many bees we actually lost in the freezing rain that we had this year?
The percent? There was a survey that was sent out about 3 weeks ago, and I haven't seen that. No, it's been more than that. About a month ago, month to 6 weeks. I haven't seen the results of it, but anecdotal, just talking to the beekeepers in this area, and I haven't talked to any commercial beekeepers, but it's probably 50%, maybe more. Depends on where in the country, but here locally, I think it's probably 50%. I personally have never lost 50%. I lost this year, I had 10 and I lost 2. I've had beekeepers that say they didn't lose any, but their hives are weak and their hives are still struggling. I've talked to one commercial beekeeper that said that he didn't actually lose hives, but that his queens didn't appear to be good and healthy. And he was having trouble getting the queens to go out and mate because the weather was so bad that the drones weren't congregating. So I can't give you an exact number because I haven't seen the results of the survey.
All right. And Jack was wondering if, all the smoke from the fires out on the West Coast right now, do you think that those are disorienting the bees or hurting the pollen collection in that region?
I would say yes. As a matter of fact, beekeepers do smoke the bees. When we go into the hive, we use a device called a smoker. And what it does is essentially mask the scent of the pheromone. So when we're working the hive, if they get alarmed, they release that pheromone. And if we smoke them a little bit, we don't use a lot of smoke that masks the pheromone. So I can't imagine that all that smoke would not have an impact. I haven't read anywhere where I'm not aware of anyone that's published a study yet. I imagine some of those will be coming forth. But seeing how my bees react to the smoke when we smoke them, I can only imagine that yes, they would be impacted.
All right, then Kathy's wondering do the bees that sting on the venom collecting pad, do those also die?
Yes. Well, I'm going to back up here for just a moment. When I read the article, they did not, I don't think they died. The material is made from it's a material that doesn't catch the barb. Typically the barb will get stuck in tissue like your arm, but there are some, I read where there are some animals that bees can sting and the barb doesn't actually get stuck, if you can imagine that. I don't recall which animals those were. It's an article I read, oh gosh, it's been a few years ago. But yeah, they use something on there to keep the stinger from sticking. So they went back, and I suppose they and again in the study, I didn't read the whole thing through as to exactly how they manipulated that pad. I would imagine if you put it in front of a hive, you'd have to take it away and let the hive recover for a while, move it off to another hive, and so on and so forth.
We don't have any, I don't see the questions right this second, but John was remarking that the Master Gardeners did a program on pollinator plants for the area and said you could check out the August website report for what information they had on pollinators.
Oh yeah, Master Gardeners, I love those folks. That's where I get a lot of my information every fall and spring when I plant flowers and bushes and stuff, because I'm always trying to plant xeriscape bee-friendly plants and butterfly-friendly plants. So they're always very helpful because I'm a terrible gardener.
I don't see any other questions right now. So thanks again for your presentation. Very interesting, and for answering everybody's questions. I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight and invite everybody to come back next month, as we're going to have Clint Perkins, who's a graduate research assistant at Texas Tech University. And he's going to be telling us about the skunks of Texas. So should be interesting as well. So thanks a lot again, Phil, and thanks everybody for coming. And we will see you next month.